Check one, check two. Welcome to Mindfulness Off the Cushion. If you're familiar with the challenges of living mindfully and are looking for help in your daily dance with suffering, our goal is to be a resource for you. So let's jump straight in to Mindfulness Off the Cushion, brought to you by the Austin Mindfulness Center. Hello and welcome back to episode 2 of Mindfulness Off the Cushion. I'm once again joined by our 3 co-hosts, Christina Filburn, Patrick Harris, and Claudio Barrientos. Let's briefly remind our listeners who we are. Christina, who are you and why are you here?
Hi, Lance. Happy to be here. My name is Christina Filburn. I'm an LCSW licensed clinical social worker licensed here in the state of Texas as well as New York. And I specialize in trauma-focused, mindfulness-based stress reduction.
Hey, Lance. First time, long time. This is Patrick Harris. I am a psychotherapist, undergraduate psychology professor, and PhD student in mind-body medicine.
My name is Claudio Barrientos, and I am a mindfulness instructor since 2010. And I'm also currently finishing my last 2 semesters of my master's in clinical social work at UTSA. That's University of Texas, San Antonio, for those of you that are not from here.
Woohoo!
Is that Roadrunners?
Roadrunners, baby.
Go Roadrunners.
Uh-huh. Baby.
So today we're going to be talking about the word practice. We use it a lot in the world of mindfulness. And it was one of the very first things that I really got hung up on as I was trying to better understand mindfulness. And now here we are with the name of the podcast, Mindfulness Off the Cushion, that sort of speaks directly to the word practice and the different forms of practice. Last week, we had a little bit of time to unpack the title and what it means. And so we started to touch on the term practice. We didn't really take the time, though, to define it. So I'd really like to spend time today to do that. This is a perfect opportunity. Here we are in episode 2 to dive a little deeper. So maybe we can get started by answering the very first question. What is practice? What do we mean by that term?
I would say that there are lots of different subjective definitions of practice in terms of progress and the practice being solidifying in some way. So quite literally sort of the repetition of something becoming something more permanent. And then in terms of mindfulness, and when we talk about the sort of neurophysiology of mindfulness-based stress reduction, as evidence has shown regarding the neural pathways and how practice can sort of reroute the neural pathways to a optimal way of living or a more mindful way of living. And I was kind of explaining it to a person this morning that the sort of neural pathways being like a lock system in our brain and being able to put up barriers and boundaries around certain parts of flow to our certain parts of our brain and then kind of reroute it to other parts. I think practice is in where to put the lockdown and how to reroute the path and how to continue forging those new pathways that may have been different from the past.
I think it's funny, like every time you say, I know we talked about practice a little bit last time too, is that I just have this like Pavlovian response of being a classically trained musician that practice just represented, oh, there goes my social life, oh, there goes anything fun. Like we had the saying that proper preparation prevents poor performance. So I'm sure my microphone's picking up all those P sounds, but there's that sense of like practice and prepare now for this performance in the future. When in reality, obviously there's other colloquial uses of the term practice. And when we're talking about practice and mindfulness, we're talking about actually the act of doing something, not so much like the act of preparing for something. But I think people that are new to mindfulness might not distinguish the two, that they believe that there's these rigid practices to use when the time comes. Like I'm going to meditate so that I'm ready for a bad day. And in a sense, that's true. But mindfulness isn't something that can be condensed into a thing. I liken it similar to religion. So if we're looking at Christianity, for instance, and I'm picking Christianity because it's just one of the more predominant religions here in the United States. But if you look at Christianity, there's formal things that you can do. You can pray, you can go to church, you can read the Bible, you can go to Bible studies. And these are formal practices, but you're not only religious when you're doing these things, right? Because if you're going to be Christian, then you have to do everything, the burden of responsibility that comes with that, abiding by the 10 commandments and following the teachings of the leaders of the church, depending on like your denomination and their interpretation of the Bible. So you're not a Christian when you're in church, and then you go back to being an angry, raging person on 35. Like, you are still called to practice that same Christian mentality, even outside of these formal practices. And I think that's where I kind of disagree with some people when I've had these conversations about mindfulness, is that you're practicing mindfulness when you're formally meditating, versus mindfulness can be this look of like, you're always in a form of meditation. You're always rediscovering your place in the world, or to borrow from Shapiro's work, you're always focusing on your intention, attention, and attitude in any given moment, because that's mindfulness. To where some people believe that cultivating mindfulness has to come from these rigid fixed points of meditating, of deep breathing, of these other things. But that's kind of what initially comes to mind when I think of mindfulness practice.
I think that there is an arbitrary line that we tend to want to create between the formal meditation practice and the informal meditation practice. And I think that that's the line that you're pointing to. As my daily meditation practice strengthened throughout the years, that line started to become less arbitrary and it started to dissolve. The question wasn't so much, how do I bring my practice into my daily life? The question kind of flipped, is how do I bring my daily life into my practice? And I think that that is a really rich area to explore. I think that at first it's helpful to create these, let's say, buckets, but once we begin to deepen our understanding of the practice, we start to do away with these buckets. We start to do away with these arbitrary lines and begin to see that all of life is an opportunity for you to practice. Saying, why should we limit those states of mind that we cultivate in our formal meditation practice to just our formal meditation practice, right? Saying these states of mind that I'm talking about is when we sit and practice formally, we're practicing a certain sense of, perhaps at times, a certain sense of calm and concentration and integrity. And I don't know, for me, it's a certain practice of kindness that I practice with myself when I'm formally meditating. But that shouldn't stop on the cushion. The question is, how do I make my life an area where I want to also bring those qualities of mind into? So I think that it's a really, really rich area to explore. And I hope that we can unpack it more and more right there.
So you use the term on the cushion a few times. And to clarify, I don't know if I'm speaking for everybody, but when we're referring to on the cushion, I think we're even making the distinction of being on the cushion, you're in this place of formal practice, versus being off the cushion, we're going out into the world. So I'm sure throughout this run, you'll hear us use that term kind of throughout, but wanted to clarify that. But yeah, I definitely agree with that. I think I would expand on really the only thing that I would consider a formal mindfulness practice that would need to continue throughout, that can really only exist in these little windows, is the education component. Like, it's not even so much like only reflecting inward. It's not so much only meditating, because we also have to expand our worldview. That's a significant portion of mindfulness, is changing our perception, our being in the world, our lens that we're experiencing the world through. And we can really only do that by exposing ourselves to new ideas, to new ways of thinking, to new that. So if we're not also practicing that within the context of adding everything that we're learning into practice, then we're kind of missing out on a huge piece of mindfulness, because you're going to plateau. You're going to feel better physiologically because you're going to be practicing how to lower your stress and how to not get emotionally reactive and caught up in all of that. But you're going to get to a point where you just plateau and there's nowhere else to go, because I've done everything my instruction manual has told me, and I didn't buy version 2.0 yet. So I don't know where to go after this.
And the good thing about practice, in reference to what y'all are saying, is kind of just due to human evolution, there's no such thing as reaching like this sort of peak of practice. Like the idea of practice is that there is no essential finish line. A lot of people in practice saying there's an anonymous sports quote. I played softball, but the the more you sweat in practice, the less you bleed in battle. Referencing the more battles you want to encounter, or not want, but the more battles that occur, the more practice in those battles in of itself make the bleeding restricted, metaphorically. As well as the other point I wanted to add too was, like a lot of other things in psychotherapy, I like to explore with my clients. It's not a matter of whether people think practice is important or not. It's sometimes the barriers or challenges that get in the way of practicing. And sometimes I think that is a good strategy to figure out another form of practice, which may be parts of our feelings of self-worth, our feelings around our attention span, the ability to be vulnerable, because these things are all extremely necessary to be in practice, formally or informally, quote unquote.
So on a related note, the second thing that I kept getting hung up on as I was learning mindfulness is the word itself, mindfulness, and is it meditation? My wife, as I mentioned in the first episode, discovered mindfulness and embraced mindfulness about 5 years ago or so. And so as I was sort of an innocent bystander observing this experience and listening to her talk, some of the times she'd use the term mindfulness. Some of the time she was talking about her meditation or her meditation practice. Often I hear Claudio use the term mindfulness meditation. We see, I think it was John Kabat-Zinn, here we are mentioning JKZ again, in his masterclass. I think it is titled Mindfulness and Meditation. So let me just throw it out there. Is it the same darn thing? Let's unpack that for a minute.
I think it's semantics. Like we have the way that our mind works, or how the brain functions, and we make schemas for things. We like to organize everything in nice, neat little boxes. And then so we get really fussy, like when things get out of that box, because we experience cognitive dissonance and we're like, oh, we don't have like a frame of reference for this. This makes me uncomfortable. We see this all the time. And I think that's just in our nature to do that with even like words, like separating mindfulness and meditation. It's like exercise. Are you only exercising when you're at the gym, or are you considering walking to your car exercise? Because if we're looking at the literal definition of exercise, which I'm sure has something to do with moving your body, exerting effort, and elevating your heart rate, like you're doing that by doing that. You're doing that at the grocery store. You're doing that by sitting down. If you're awake, you're exercising because you're engaging muscles to keep you stable and keep your head upright. Even if you don't feel like you're putting in the same amount of effort as lifting a dumbbell, you're still technically exercising. So it's our nature to kind of tease out the just painful, excruciating details to really put something in a box, when in reality, mindfulness and meditation are used interchangeably, at least like in the older, like Zen Buddhist philosophy, because all mindfulness is meditation and all meditation is mindfulness. You could be doing it with more or less intention, but if you're actively practicing mindfulness, you're actively meditating, and vice versa.
Agreed. I think both those terms can be pretty synonymous and interchangeable with a sort of state of mind. And if we were going to be sort of rigid about it and we're terming mindfulness meditation, literally mindfulness meditations, or piggybacking off of the idea of exercising, I guess if we were to broaden, to movement, is if there was a category for movement, then exercise would be part of movement, and both are movements. I think meditation would be the exercise in this piece where they're both considered mindfulness. But I believe sometimes if we're going to be rigid about it, that meditation is a form of mindfulness, etc. So it can be pretty interchangeable. I also, the mindfulness is the sort of general presence of being aware of what's going on as well, right? So, a lot of people, sometimes it's as simple as making sure and checking that you're not checking out. So making sure you are always sort of checked in.
Sure. So I think that we can all agree that mindfulness and meditation can be used synonymously, because I think that I guess from what I'm hearing from all of us here is that we do use it synonymously. In my programs, I do use it synonymously. I can also, as a former marketing guy and, in my other life, I want to say before I entered the world of mindfulness meditation, I was always very curious about marketing and marketing strategies. And I think that one of the reasons why the word meditation has been taken sometimes taken away from the word mindfulness is simply because the word meditation scares off a lot of people. I think that was, I attended a workshop with Dr. John Kabat-Zinn, the founder of MBSR. And that was one of the reasons that he didn't include meditation in MBSR, because in 1979, which is when he launched the very first MBSR program, he thought about the general Boston community and, introducing these practices and these modalities in the clinical setting had never been done before. So why introduce a word that's going to create dissonance with individuals, with society? Let's replace it with something else. He came up with mindfulness-based stress reduction, which is, I think, a genius play. For me, it's I liken it to when you have to give medicine to your doggy, to your pet. I sometimes wrap that medicine in something really yummy. The pet is still taking the medicine, which is what you want to give, but you just wrap it in something different, something more attractive, more palatable. So I think that that's one of the reasons why sometimes the word meditation isn't used in mindfulness. So it's a little bit of a marketing, which is totally cool.
It also, now that we're talking about it, does seem like it is kind of, I can understand the sort of reason for wanting to change the verbiage. But I think as someone who likes things a little more directly, I don't know, what is the trust like for individuals once they realize that mindfulness is the same as meditation? Does that, for individuals who have sort of, not to bring up, diagnostic stuff, but medical trauma or trauma around or dissonance around distrusting of words and concepts. My alternative to that sometimes is explaining to different individuals that they may be the same thing and kind of chat a little bit about the obstacles, or let's talk about the dissonance that gets involved when you think about it. Because there obviously is a discrepancy between what we're uninterested in doing and what we will be doing. So if we're avoiding mindfulness if we're avoiding meditation because of the word, but then we're getting involved with mindfulness, there seems to be some ambiguity there. And the other piece I was going to say as well, sorry to sneak 2 points into one breath, but right. Some people say, right, with meditation, the idea of meditation is to clear your mind. Whereas some people with mindfulness, you want to fill your mind with things that are made with intention. And so I think that there is a sort of rigid distinction there that one could argue.
Dang, y'all are bringing the heat today with all these good points. I do like that kind of like that fear of bait and switch of like, oh wait, this is meditation. No, I'm out. Like you can lure them in with mindfulness and then you kind of drop that bomb. But to expand on the exercise metaphor that I forgot who one of the handsome panelists here brought up originally, but if it's the same thing as like physical therapy, right? Like if you have somebody that suffered a traumatic car accident and has to go to physical therapy, you're not going to scare them and be like, all right, let's do some exercise, get you back on your feet. But that's essentially what you're doing in physical therapy. You're doing exercise in a more controlled setting. Just like meditation is the same mindfulness practice that you're doing day in and day out. You're just doing it in a more controlled, safe setting. Like it's a lot easier for most people to meditate in a quiet room with some cool incense and like groovy music playing in the background than it is to go on like a busy city street and try to collect yourself when there's so much going on, or in the middle of the workday and you just got your 110th email and it's only 10 a.m. Like you can still practice meditation there, but it's going to be significantly harder than in that control situation. Somebody that suffered a physical trauma can still exercise, but it's much easier and safer to do it in that controlled situation. So kind of having that conversation, and really, again, that discrepancy in definition really kind of comes down to the perception, because there's going to be people that fight you tooth and nail to say, no, physical therapy is not exercise. It's physical therapy, but you're still exercising and building muscle to be able to walk on your own.
Sure. And I guess 2 quick points here is that, one way that one can view your formal meditation practice is mindfulness with training wheels. In the sense, when I say mindfulness meditation practice is mindfulness with training wheels, in the sense that when we are practicing sitting down, making sure that the room is quiet, the lighting is perfect, incense is on, we're kind of creating the optimal environment for us to rest and relax and bring a sense of calm and clarity to our inner world. So that's what I mean by that. On the other hand, I also don't, the last thing that I think that we should be doing as mindfulness, well, I'll speak for myself as a mindfulness instructor, the last thing I want to be doing is tricking anybody into practicing. I think that for me, that's why I like to use the word mindfulness meditation together, because I want people to understand that the way that I instruct, there is meditation involved, and that's nothing to be scared of or shy away from. I think that a wise instructor is trying to always make it as accessible as possible.
I actually take the Karate Kid approach, where if they're already put off by meditation, then we work on mindfulness skills. And then once we practice a few of those, then it's like, you've been waxing on and waxing off the whole time. Do this. Oh, look, you're meditating. See, it's not so scary. So it's not even so much like a bait and switch. It's learning to walk before you run, but then showing that there's so many similarities between walking and running. I don't remember if it was in the last episode or when we were like prepping, but I talked about that there are contraindications for meditation, like people with significant traumas or delusions or active psychosis. Like,
sure,
that formal meditation of sitting down and trying to quiet your mind is a contraindication in those senses. So you don't want to like bait and switch, like, hey, we're just going to like take a moment and just not talk for a while and see what happens, because you don't know what's going to happen. But for them, you might expand on other functional strengths that they might have with the intention of like building up to it if that's their goal. But in terms of people that are just kind of put off by the label or the stigma that comes with meditation, like, oh, that's what hippies do, or that's what people out in California do. I don't do that. It's like, well, you garden. That's essentially it. Like, you're not doing 10 different things. You're connecting with the dirt. Or you told me that the best part of your day is picking up your child at the end of a workday and having that moment. That's meditation right there. So looking for these opportunities to kind of Karate Kid these skills into existing functional strengths and behaviors, just connecting more intentionally with it.
And I think that the key thing there is connecting more intentionally with the act of gardening, because a lot of people can be gardening, but they could have a million other things going on in the mind. They could also have their headphones on, listening to music, listening to this very podcast while gardening. And the question becomes is, if you're intentionally trying to be present while gardening, you're trying to limit certain stimuli, and you're trying to just bring awareness to the moment by moment experience of what it feels like to be a human being, putting your hand in the soil, planting, and so forth. So the intention is definitely, the secret sauce there.
Well, I guess it begs the question too, when we try to sort of like intellectualize, the word or the concept of practice. I mean, a big piece of it, right, is feeling comfortable in the present, and how uncomfortable that may be when thoughts are innervating, right? Really generally speaking, the layman's of depression, about dwelling on the past, or anxiety, thinking about the future. And how to kind of stay in the present moment. And, the part of mindfulness, I believe, is what you guys all are saying, especially as considered a quote unquote expert in trauma, that, if there are sort of trauma triggers or things that come up, how to become more of a complete person, being able to feel comfortable thinking about the traumatic pieces of the past, still knowing that in that moment you are actually safe. And it's not just the actual feeling of being safe, but it's proving through mindfulness practice that you actually are safe. And the other piece I was going to add to that as well is that the sort of this mechanism behind not sort of a bait and switch, but going back to I guess the religious reference, not to proselytize to anybody about how great mindfulness is, because it's almost impossible to kind of get somebody engaged in that way. I believe, or not impossible, but I don't know if the secret sauce will be created by people's awareness or mindful awareness of their sort of the benefit of mindfulness in their life. And so that's kind of how I practice, based on professionally and personally kind of assessing where people are in the mindfulness aspects of it. How are, motivational interviewing terms? Are they pre-contemplative about it? And so not trying to convince anybody, of the secret sauce. If people are not looking for the secret sauce, they're just not going to have access to it.
This podcast is sponsored by the Austin Mindfulness Center, the premier mental health counseling center in Texas for mindfulness-based therapy, education, and coaching. If you're an individual or couple struggling with stress, anxiety, depression, relationship issues, or you're just looking to better equip yourself to gracefully navigate these turbulent times, you can visit us online at austinmindfulness.org and request an appointment today. Now let's get back to our podcast. So let's explore the link between formal and informal practice. Claudio, I think it was you in episode 1. You had said something along the lines of your formal practice informs your informal practice. Tell me more about that.
I think that we've been discussing this very topic throughout the last 15, 20 minutes right now. I think that there is an interesting interplay between formal meditation practice and informal meditation practice. I said, you paraphrased me by saying that the formal meditation practice informs the informal meditation practice, but it's also the other way around as well. The informal practice also informs the formal practice. So it's never as clear cut as we want to make it. It's always bi-direction. It's always systemic in that regard. It's not so much how do we create these separations between formal practice and informal practice, but how do we create a cohesiveness around both formal and informal? How do we integrate what it means to be mindful in our day-to-day living as wisely and as skillfully as possible? I'm still exploring that every day. I can tell you that it's in the difficult moments where I can see the practice bring me the most amount of benefit. So I am grateful for those difficult moments because it reinforces that which I am practicing in my formal meditation is informing my day-to-day life. So I welcome that. I didn't used to do that before. So
I'm a little curious now, as someone who practices mindfulness and meditation in all sorts. What is the difference between formal and informal? If there is a difference, when you look back at, are we sort of ethnocentrism here in regards to the sort of Eastern, Western practices of mindfulness, right? When you look back at sort of Paramahamsa, Yoganda, and the sort of Eastern meditation practice, it's debatable in those conversations whether there is a difference between formal and informal.
I guess I'll speak for the 12-day Vipassana retreats that I've been a part of. I've done 2 of those 12-day Vipassana retreats, and it's about, you take the 5 precepts, which are ethical standards that you try to abide by during those 12 days. So there's an ethical component to that. But then for 12 hours a day throughout the day, you're going into the meditation hall and you're sitting and bringing awareness to the moment-by-moment experience of the body. And you're essentially, the first 3 days, you're bringing awareness to the moment-by-moment experience of the breath moving in and out of the body. And you're doing that in intervals of 60 to 120 minutes at a time. So there is steeped in Buddhist practices, there is a formal meditation history there. And that's the schooling that I've been informed by right there. So I would consider that which I was doing when I was going to the meditation hall and meditating for those 60 to 120 minute intervals, I would consider that my formal meditation practice. But then the encouragement is, okay, now that it's done, you don't go back to your room and bring out your iPad and start, cruising the web. The encouragement is, can you stay with this mind that you've cultivated in your formal practice? Can you stay with it as long as possible outside of your formal meditation practice? The continuity of mindfulness. That's what you get to explore that's what I got to explore in a 12-day Vipassana retreat.
Okay. And that's also, but a Western seated meditation retreat formally. And maybe that could be a next topic, Eastern versus Western ideas of mindfulness and meditation, right? Because if it's being taught by someone in the Eastern sort of civilization, we're teaching a sort of formal Western meditation practice.
No, that was actually the teachings that we received were recordings of S.N. Goenka, which the Burmese teacher that started the 12-day Vipassana retreats back in the 70s and the 80s. That's S.N. Goenka. So every day we would watch a video of his teachings from the 1980s, and as well as have a formal instructor there that was just there to support us. So that was the environment of that Vipassana retreat right there.
I like that you recognize that you got to a place with the on the cushion work, and then you go back to try to stretch that place out more off the cushion or attain that same place off the cushion. I guess, like, to make it a metaphor, it's like going to a cooking class and you eat the meal that you're about to learn how to make, and you're like, okay, this is what I'm working towards. This is what I can accomplish. Now I'm going to go home with all of my ingredients and make it at home. And it's not going to be perfect the first time, and it's going to take a while. There's going to be some trial and error, but eventually I'm going to do it, knowing that it's not going to be a picture perfect facsimile, that I'm going to put my own spin on it because I'm going to add my own flavor to it. But that's still what I'm striving towards. That's pretty cool. I remember one time I went to some like hippie retreat out in the middle of nowhere on this like commune. And one of the nights, this is actually with Patch Adams. I don't know if I've talked about this, the part that he's a huge hippie, but so he has a commune at the Gesundheit Institute. And one night we were talking about just kind of like the history of health, which is fascinating, how the history of just healthcare has been so intertwined with religion. Even like the first hospitals being run by the Catholic Church, and only like within the last 100 years has it separated its identity of like medical providers from religious systems. Anyways, that's a tangent. But Patch was talking about like shamans, how a lot of it was just like energy medicine, being present, just being there for people. And he asked if anybody was suffering at the moment. And I had just experienced a significant trauma that I'm sure I'll talk about at some point on this podcast, but I was still suffering. I had just watched, I was present for a mass shooting. I had just watched people die. I was pretty rattled, still having nightmares. And I thought it was a rhetorical question. So I raised my hand. I look around, I'm the only one with my hand raised. And I was like, okay, crap. So he asked me to come up, and he was like, well, let's just demonstrate what one of the healing ceremonies used to look like. So I laid down, and they all surrounded me, and they, I think there was 3 or 4 steps. It was first like, don't touch, just hover your hands over and just be there with your intention of love or healing energy or good thoughts or good vibes, whatever it is. And then touch my body. So then a bunch of hands were placed on me, same thing. And then, meditate with the Om and still just try to radiate that positivity and be there as a community of healing. And then it's Patch Adams. So of course he's going to add his like clowning and silliness to it. And he was like, okay, the last one, I want you to just fart all over him. Just go. And then there was like one more that was like, just with your fingers go woogity, woogity, woogity. And so the last 2 were silly, but it was just like this powerful experience. And then afterwards, like, there was nothing healing or magical or restorative. I didn't get a shot with like anti-trauma medicine, but I just felt so good. And I remember having breakfast with him the next morning, and he was like, he was asking about the experience. He was like, you can take that with you at any point. And like, that's always resonated with me. It's like, no one physically reached inside of me, changed anything. That was a moment that I created by my own perception. Cause I could have been like, this is weird hippie stuff. I don't like this at all. I can't wait for this to be over. But instead I leaned into it, and I was like, this is amazing. Like, I haven't experienced this. I was open to it. So I created that experience. I created those warm butterflies. And so that's what I'm actively trying to capture in any moment. And that's just going to be, again, based on my practice and perception of the experience of learning how to respond and see the world rather than emotionally react. So that's kind of what came up, Claudio, when you were talking about that, capturing that moment and going and recreating it on your own.
For me, the language that I use is not so much of capturing and recreating, but it's about using that moment that you experience in the meditation hall as a reference point that you have to carry with you throughout life. And the reference point that I have for, one of the retreats that I had there was the reference points of being able to be with pain, physical pain, more than I had ever experienced. So when you sit for 10 to 12 hours a day, there was a lot of physical pain that arose in my body, especially in my knees. And there's a lot of emotions that come up around the experience of pain. And the question that I asked myself in the formal meditation practice was, how could I learn to be with this pain, the here and now? And how could I begin to embrace this experience of pain? How could I explore it with curiosity and kindness and welcoming it into my experience? And I was able to achieve a state that I have never been able to replicate, but that is still a reference point for me. And I carry that with me every day. I 3 weeks ago, I'll use an example of being able to be with pain. 3 weeks ago, I was part of my dog died. He was actually killed, attacked by 2 dogs, and he was under my care when that happened. And the amount of grief and pain that I experienced throughout that day and the following days was huge. But that lesson that I learned in my meditation, in that meditation hall in Georgia, taught me something about what it means to be a human being experiencing pain. Even though in that hall it was physical pain, this was emotional pain. So it is a reference point, and I think that's important right there.
Quick apologies to our listeners. We did, in fact, run out of time while recording this episode. We have since made some changes to our schedules, so it won't happen again. Please join us next week in episode 3. We're going to call it Practice Part 2. We'll pick up exactly where we left off this week. See you soon.